All right, welcome everyone to the New Hampshire Peace Actions Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Chris Ann Evanson. I've been a board member with New Hampshire Peace Action for a while now, and we're happy to welcome you tonight for just one in a series of conversations we've been having on various social justice and peace issues. So first of all, let me alert those of you new to us that New Hampshire Peace Action educates, mobilizes, and organizes to build a more peaceful and just future for everyone. We envision a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. And in the spirit of understanding and respect, we'd like to take just a moment now to acknowledge that we do the work we do here in New Hampshire on traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. And we acknowledge with and we honor the land and waterways that they have.
Have we lost Chris Ann? I can finish that sentence. It's have been stewarding throughout the generations. Hopefully we get Chris Ann back here in a second. Have been stewarding throughout the generations. Hopefully we get Chris. Let's give her a moment. All right. Hang on. I'm going to just take over until we get Chris Ann back. So we started this conversation series at the beginning of the corona pandemic as a way to continue our public education work. And we've discovered that it's effective enough that we've decided to keep going, even if the pandemic ends. We are really excited tonight to bring you Brandon Lemay, who is the homelessness justice coordinator for, and I'm sorry if I got your title wrong there, Brandon, for Rights and Democracy. Brandon is coming to us at this time of year during the season where the nights get really long. We like to take a moment to remember those who don't have a home. We always want to dedicate a program to recognizing how little our society invests in combating homelessness, in particular when we compare it to our primary issue, which is working on militarism. And we just passed an $858 billion Pentagon budget, National Defense Authorization Act, which would end homelessness many, many times over. So Brandon, thank you so much for being here tonight and helping us make these connections.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm so glad to be here with all y'all here. Would you like me to just kind of go into my introduction here, explain a little bit about who I am and what I've done? Yeah, fantastic. So before I introduce myself, I just kind of want to play off of what you said there, Will, about budgets. And that is that when we prioritize something in this country, we can make it happen. We can do whatever we want. I hear frequently from politicians, listen, we just don't have the money. But when it comes time for a new M1 Abrams tank or some cool cruise missiles, well, magically we find the money. It's just a matter of what we prioritize in our society. And I don't think that we prioritize those in need in our country, and we instead value the defense contractors a lot more. But I'll get off my soapbox for the moment on that. My name is Brandon Lemay, and I am the New Hampshire Statewide Housing Justice Organizer for Rights and Democracy. I'm also a volunteer with the New Hampshire Mutual Aid Relief Fund. I cannot speak for New Hampshire Mutual Aid, nor any of the individuals here. I'm just a volunteer with them. We're 100% volunteer run. All proceeds go to those in need directly. But after that disclaimer, I just want to say housing organizing wasn't what I always thought I wanted to do, but I cannot imagine working on any other issue at this time. As somebody who grew up in a union family, I'm able to appreciate the housing struggle as another side of the coin as the labor struggle. Housing requires labor, and labor needs housing. I started off as a climate justice organizer with NextGen and the League of Conservation Voters. Later on, I go to work for Mayor Joyce Craig's campaign back in 2019. My time as a member with Rights and Democracy started around the first time that I was evicted in 2017. I didn't know what my rights were back then, so I panicked when my landlord notified my roommates and I that she was selling the house and wanted to show it without any tenants occupying it. We thought we had 30 days to leave. I wish we knew that she didn't notify us in the proper manner. And I wish we knew that we had more than 30 days in reality. But we didn't know any better, much like a lot of the tenants that I now work with. So we immediately started searching frantically. In a healthy housing market, about 4 to 8% of all apartments should be vacant at any given time. Back, and this was 2017, Manchester's vacancy rate was about 2%. So, about half of like an okay market should be. In 2022, that vacancy rate is essentially zero. And what that means in plain English is that as soon as an apartment is empty, there's somebody willing to move into it right away. This gives landlords a lot of power and gives tenants very little power. But back to my story, we eventually found a house that was in our budget and signed that lease quickly. The next place was more expensive, but it was in line with what other landlords were charging. What we didn't know was that the home wasn't properly winterized. Gaps in the walls let hot air out and mice in. With 4 roommates, we were spending about $200 a month in the winter to basically keep our house at 55 degrees. The next couple of places that we moved weren't much better. And that's a typical experience when faced with eviction. Your sole source of warmth and shelter is no longer secure, and you're afraid of where you could end up next. I was lucky enough to have a support system around me. I have a great relationship with my parents, and the offer to move back in was always on the table for me. But what if I couldn't afford rent at the new place, and I didn't have parents to move it back in with? I'd likely be facing the threat of houselessness. This is a common story now in Manchester and all around New Hampshire. Evictions take a toll on families. It can wear down your mental health in ways that can spiral out of control. Sociologist Matthew Desmond writes in his book, Evicted, Property and Profit in the American City. I highly recommend this book, by the way. Again, it's called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. But he says, 1 in 2 recently evicted mothers report multiple symptoms of clinical depression, double the rates of similar mothers who were not forced from their homes. Even after years pass, evicted mothers are less happy, energetic, and optimistic than their peers. When several patients committed suicide in the days leading up to their eviction, a group of psychiatrists published a letter in Psychiatric Services identifying eviction as a significant precursor to suicide. I later became a paid community organizer with Rights and Democracy around Manchester and Nashua. But the #1 issue impacting our members was housing. Well, it wasn't my title yet. I was de facto a housing organizer. And this was around 2020. And around this time, we had somewhere between 50 and 100 people living on the lawn of Hillsborough Superior North Court. This was on Chestnut Street in Manchester. There were only 6 shelter beds available statewide, and they're asking almost 100 people to move. I called the homelessness hotline, 211, and checked myself. Again, 6 beds available in the entire state. No plan for them to go. The government just wanted them gone. A few friends of mine did some outreach, going tent to tent on that lawn, and asked those houseless residents how they felt about the pending sweep. Most just wanted help being driven to their next spot. A few wanted to stay and fight. We organized around-the-clock protest / police watch, and it stalled the sweep for 4 days. I just want to note that the state sent more undercover cops to our protest than social workers. And that kind of beckons back to where are our priorities? And we value policing more than social work. Where that camp once was now has a fence around it. There are no gates to this fence. No one gets to use that bit of green space now. While that eviction was enacted by the state, the city of Manchester is just as happy to sweep encampments too. We've counted over 24 encampment sweeps done by Manchester police in the past couple of years. Cities and towns across the state have been equally as brutal as Manchester. Keene, Concord, Dover, Hanover, and many other municipalities have conducted their own sweeps without providing good housing alternatives. I just want to say that houselessness is a policy failure on a local, state, and federal level. Now, I just want to go over some causes of houselessness, but I want to address that I use the term houselessness over homelessness, and there are two main reasons why. When we were protesting the courthouse encampment sweep, I was chatting with a friend of mine while I was on cop watch. I said to him, "We need homes for everybody here." And one woman in a nearby tent said to me, "I have a home in this tent with my family. What we need is a house." And my second point is relating to the first point. A home is a concept that can exist anywhere. There's a corny saying that home is where the heart is, but it's true. Houseless folks don't lack homes and communities. They lack housing. A house is a material object that they lack. And I want to say that houselessness is often attributed to a myriad of different things, like substance use, mental health, low wages, and high rents. In my personal opinion, I believe that substance use and mental health are over-attributed to houselessness, causing a stigma against the houseless. According to a study published in the Annals of Applied Statistics, communities where people spend more than 32% of their income on rent can expect a more rapid increase in houselessness. Yes, mental health and substance use are two factors that can lead to housing insecurity, but as I've mentioned earlier, housing insecurity leads to mental health in various ways of coping with it. And I want to use myself as an example again. I have mental health issues, and I have a problem with alcohol consumption. Because I'm well supported and I have access to healthcare, I was able to get therapy, medication, and now I'm sober. Lacking housing would have left me unable to keep steady employment, which would have blocked me from having access to healthcare. Housing is seen as a commodity and not as a public good. It is to be bought and sold on a market and not guaranteed as a basic human right. I view housing as similar to insulin in one way. You'll pay anything you can to keep getting it. Going without it can lead to death, and the supply is artificially restricted. I believe this is a form of legal extortion. While supply and demand are partially to blame for increased housing costs, there are many factors that prevent affordable housing from being built. One being development being gate-kept behind for-profit developers who prefer to build expensive units. It's not profitable to house poor people, so the market doesn't want to do it. Zoning laws make building densely nearly impossible, and real estate and landlord interests want to continue to restrict the supply of housing just enough so they can profit, but not enough to lower the value of their existing housing stock. Landlords and realtors will always be served first in our current system, not us. I'm not convinced that we can build our way out of this crisis, even if building still needs to be done. We need stronger tenant protections, like caps on how much rent can be increased. We need to find ways to take housing stock out of the for-profit sector. People will ask me, what right does the government have to restrict what a landlord can charge for rent on their private property? And I like to explain it this way. For one, most landlords take a mortgage interest deduction, which helps landowners deduct whatever interest they pay on a mortgage from their taxes. Keep in mind, mortgages are federally guaranteed. And who is the federal government? It's us, the taxpayers. We subsidize landlords and homeowners. Now, there are two aspects of real estate. There's the building and there's the land. Buildings are not good financial investments. If you own a home, think of all of the money you have to put into it. Like, buildings depreciate a lot. Think about new roof tiles, water heaters, floors, pipes, wiring, everything. Part of the mortgage deduction is helping property owners deal with those costs. When a landlord invests in their property by construction, they're investing in the building. Now, the second aspect of real estate is the most valuable, and that's the land. As realtors like to say, location, location, location. A 1,500 square foot house in the middle of the desert is worth a lot less than that same house in Boston. What drives up land value though? It's public infrastructure, public transportation, schools, green spaces, and other city services. We, the taxpayer, actually generate most of the wealth in society, but the benefits are kept private. The least we can do is mandate that property owners don't take all of the wealth that is generated for them by us. And finally, I just want to focus on a couple of solutions here. So for homelessness, I am a huge supporter of something called housing first. And this is the idea that the things leading and causing homelessness, houselessness, are things that can only be addressed once somebody is under a roof and between four walls. You cannot adequately address mental health if somebody is on the street. You cannot give somebody the proper medical care if they don't have a warm place to recover in. So we need to move away from shelter systems that we currently rely on. These are all nonprofits in New Hampshire. And it's because the government doesn't want to actually provide shelters or housing for the houselessness. So they'd rather just pawn this duty off on nonprofits. I've been very critical of Families in Transition. They have really good transitional housing, but the conditions at their Manchester shelter are completely deplorable. Well, they'll spend money on things like building a new fence or painting their exterior a really fun color. They will have things like bed bugs in the shelter. They have a lift that doesn't properly work. So people that need mobility devices cannot actually move up to where the bunks are. So again, housing first is something that I think that we need for every municipality here in New Hampshire. We need to actually give folks keys in order to address the core issues that are causing the lack of housing. And for housing, I would like to reinvest in public housing while promoting social housing. And I propose doing that through community land trusts that hold the land while the buildings are owned as cooperatives. We've recently done this with manufactured home parks in New Hampshire, where an owner wants to sell their park. The residents have 60 days to purchase the park and convert it into a resident-owned community. I want to expand that to multifamily homes as well. And I believe that's how most housing should be done. I do not believe that housing should be held privately and it should be held communally. But that's pretty much all that I had there. I just want to open it back up. I don't know if you had any questions that anybody wanted to ask, or I'll throw it back to you, Will.
Should be to Chris Ann. I think her internet's back up and running.
Oh boy.
Okay, I wanted to give you a chance. Well, Brandon, I'm so sorry. I went down just as I wanted to be with you folks. So thank you so much for such a packed set of comments. There's a whole lot in there. And I'm sure we probably want to just take a few minutes and absorb what you said. And I'd like to invite those of you who are here, if you'd like to ask a question, if you would just place it into the chat. And if it is longer or if it's more involved, well, let's start with the chat to use that for Q&A, because at least on my computer, I've got at least 2 screens full of you, of the audience. So I'm not going to be able to see everyone if you raise your hand, etc. So if you have your video on and if you have questions, please feed them into the chat, and I will keep watch there. In the meantime, while we wait for those, I quite agree, better internet would be awesome. I have a couple of just kind of, I would have actually included these in my context comments in the beginning, Brandon, but a few things have struck me about the houselessness, crisis in New Hampshire. It's especially, bleak to me in the winter months. Obviously, it's not less in the summer, but wow, does it make a difference when it's 12 or 16 degrees? And I had occasion, recently, I have some family members who are hard pressed for housing or who lack it altogether. And it's scary in the winter. And yes, there are warming stations, et cetera, but it's serious. And I understand that we don't have, a huge population, but that doesn't mean that for the affected people, it's not dire. So by contrast, recently, Karen Bass was elected as the mayor of Los Angeles, and she campaigned on this issue, was elected, and has, in her first move as mayor, has declared a humanitarian emergency for the 40,000 people in Los Angeles who lack housing. So it's a huge deal. It, of course, the numbers aren't the same in New Hampshire, but I guess I have some questions for you, Brandon, and some of them are, based on your comments. And I know that you yourself are based in Manchester. I have the impression that this might be an issue that is more salient in the southern part of our state, but I'm wondering if you're also seeing it in the North Country or on the seacoast.
Yeah, so it's actually really counterintuitive that we would have a homelessness problem in rural areas like Coos County. And even when you look at things, so I mentioned vacancy rates earlier. And when I first started this job, I didn't think like, oh, there'd be like a shortage of apartments in the North Country. But the thing about it is housing options are even more bleak in the North Country. So often, and they have fewer services available. There are a lot of economic disparities between Southern New Hampshire and the North Country as well. So those that are faced with houselessness are often least able to get served. You also find that because of the nature of, we're a wonderfully forested state, one of the best things about New Hampshire, in my opinion, but houselessness can be more easily hidden in rural areas. I was really surprised to find out just how much houselessness there is in the Keene area and really in the seacoast as well. There's a huge, huge issue with houselessness. There's a really great group that's being headed up by, okay, she probably doesn't want all the credit because she is working with a group here, but Maggie Fogarty is leading up a Housing First for Stratford County, a Housing First movement. I'm hesitant to call it an organization yet. It's just a few concerned citizens or more than a few. But yeah, it's a problem all over. It's just that there are often more services available in the southern part of the state, but it's still inadequate. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. Let me turn our attention to some of these questions that have come up in the chat here. One is from Evelyn in Regina, Canada. She says, we have a lot of trouble getting the city to do something to house homeless people. What is a good way to get heard?
Well, I've been trying in my city for the past 2 years, and they're not listening. So maybe you're not the best person to ask. But no, seriously, the best thing to do is really you have to organize. You have to get people. You have to get a group of people together. Ideally, people who themselves are also facing housing insecurity. As much as we can, we try to get the houseless to come and speak at city council meetings. We had a measure that was going to criminalize houselessness. So we got 10 houseless folks to come and speak against the measure. And you know what? They still voted for the measure overwhelmingly anyway. But we are coming to every single meeting and letting them know that we're not going away until you fix the problem. Because most elected officials would rather that they just talk about boring stuff, like the board of mayor and aldermen here in Manchester. They would rather be arguing about like paying for basketball uniforms. But when we come in and we send 10 people to speak about affordable housing, they usually end up having to talk about that during the course of their meeting. So you just need to be really annoying. You need to make this issue so hot that they cannot ignore it. And I would recommend too, identify who in your city council or whatever it's called, board or whatever, you need to identify who is the best, who is your ally, who can you kind of look forward to, or do you need to move somebody to become your ally there, or do you need to run somebody that is going to be an ally? So those are all questions that I'd be happy to also talk with you individually about that as well. But really, elected officials would rather just do nothing if they could get away with it. So you just need to annoy them until they actually do something about it. And you need to grow, you need to organize. And again, like you need to have enough people there. So if you wanted to, you could shut down a meeting, but obviously, you don't want to be doing that your first time out. But yeah, I just find be as annoying as possible and also have clear policy goals. Say, I want this city to enact a housing first program. We need this city to move away from shelters. Or if your city doesn't have any shelters, I recommend fighting for one. And then once you get a shelter, then start complaining about how horrible shelters are. And then every single, demand that you actually get, start asking for the next thing up. Escalate your asks. Yeah, and I guess I'll say this too. So like, when I talked about that eviction in 2020, there were 6 shelter beds available. We protested this sweep saying, 6 beds, 100 people, how does that math work out? And what they did was they actually opened up 30 more beds. Now, again, that's not enough, but it's more than we had. So yeah, and then they now have about 138 beds in Manchester. And now that we have that, now we're complaining about the conditions of the shelter. So again, it's like, just never take any sort of thing and say, okay, we solved the problem. Always keep pressuring them to do more, because the minute that you stop attending these meetings, they're going to just slide back. They'll lose funding for the shelter. So again, you just always have to be persistent and well organized.
Thanks, Brandon. Bill Woodward has a question for you too. I think it looks like he just needs you to clarify what you were saying about policy recommendations for community-owned housing and the 60-day limit. Are you saying that in those 60 days you could get together and build a new home, or just make official a community-owned housing? Or if you could give an example of that, and whether or not you think the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund might help.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So yeah, to kind of explain what we do with mobile manufactured home parks, if an individual who owns that park or group or whatever decides they want to sell it, the residents get the right of first purchase. And then they then become the owners and are able to keep living where they're living. And the only thing that's changed is now, instead of renting, they're paying off their own mortgage, and they all collectively own it that live there. I want to expand that so that if you're living in a multifamily home, which are targeted by corporate landlords, especially on the west side of Manchester, we have a lot of triple deckers. Those are seen as a cash cow for landlords. And so what they're doing is they're coming in, they're buying these triple deckers up, often doubling the rent, renovating everybody out, and then boom, people are displaced. I would like to see a system where if you owned one of these triple deckers and you were thinking about putting it on the market, you would have to notify your tenants, and you would give them 60 days to make an offer on the apartment so that they could convert it into, you could also convert it into a condo. I don't really like condos too much, but a lot of people say that community land trusts function like condos, except they're not for profit, if that makes sense. So basically, you turn something into private housing, and then you turn the tenants into owners, and the very same building that they're living in, ideally. And then what happens there is that if you can convert it into a cooperative, and you can tie it to I'm getting too far in the weeds here, but if it existed under a community land trust, you could put stipulations on that building and saying, hey, if you wanted to rent out this apartment, you could restrict it to 30% of the area median income or whatever. which in reality would then take a corporate landlord would look at that and say, that's a really bad investment. I want to be able to charge whatever rent I want. So then they would just not want to buy that building ever. I don't know if I explained that very well, so please tell me if you need any follow-up.
It does.
That was great. Thanks. I'm a
Oh no, you muted yourself though.
I get about
it does sound like it might fold.
I've experienced I get about 5 requests to buy my 4-unit apartment house in Newmarket per month. So I know I have a cash cow for somebody, but to know the
I think it's muting you again, Bill.
Yeah, Bill, your mute is on and off.
Sorry, it flips on and off. Yeah, I think I left the cursor down there. Would you say that people renting only want to stay a limited amount of time? Are they really in a position to join a community purchase?
No, as of right now, it's not something that we have a lot of mechanisms for right now. So, for instance, with manufactured home parks, there's a state law saying that you have to give 60 days notice, and they also send a notification to the community loan fund. And yeah, so the community loan fund gets a message saying, oh, this landlord's selling or this park owner is selling, let's reach out to the tenants right there. So I would like to have eventually a similar kind of program in place just for more types of housing.
Good, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for the question.
Thanks, Brandon. So it sounds like it's folding maybe right into Mike's question, which also has to do with tenant-owned trailer parks, which is not a new idea. So he asks, how do you propose to get more people involved with this type of cooperative action? Because a lot of I don't know if I'm reading into Mike's question, but a lot of renters are in, maybe survival mode. It's hard to think beyond your own specific needs to get into a cooperative arrangement. So what's your proposal for getting more people involved with such things like that?
Yeah, so first off, a lot of this ties into a lot of the tenant organizing that I'm doing. I frequently, more and more am being reached out to by tenants who said, oh my God, my building just got sold. And we're actually working with State Representative Ellen Reed, particularly around Newmarket on this. And pretty much all the tenants say, hey, if we had the option to buy out this building from our landlord, we would absolutely love this. But I think the way that we can actually get this in the future is we need to have a stronger tenant movement. Right now, there is a small, but still, not powerful enough yet movement out there. So it's going to take organized tenants. We are building up a statewide tenant union in New Hampshire. We're looking to launch it in early 2023. And a lot of this is going to be advocating for tenants, organizing them into tenant unions, resisting rent hikes, but also advocating for these policies in Concord. So right now we're working on just trying to pass a 60-day notification bill for when a landlord is trying to sell their building. So we're just trying to get that one little victory. Remember when I said earlier, when you get a little victory and you say, okay, great, what do I get next? So we're going to get that. We're going to get the notification. And then once that passes, then we're going to get the right of first purchase passed. Because again, we know the current makeup of the legislature. But we feel that if we keep on fighting long enough, that we're going to get those policy wins that we need. And a lot of this is going to have to be public education as well. So we're hoping to do a lot more like educational sessions on like what a community land trust is, how to form one. And I just also want to shout out to a group that I help organize, the Manchester Housing Alliance. We are forming a community land trust in 2023. We are looking at starting with a multifamily home. And converting it into a limited equity co-op. So we feel that, by establishing one, by getting tenants involved, by getting just allies, involved too, pushing for these policies that we need, that's going to get us what we need as well. I'm also going to say too, stronger tenant protections are needed because it's really hard to organize tenants, as you said, when they're in survival mode, right? That survival mode really makes it easy for landlords to come in and give one of those tenants a sweetheart deal to say, hey, don't join this tenant union. I'm going to give you the 3rd floor loft. I'm going to take $100 off a month. And yeah, just leave it and then say like you were like bullied into like joining it. So when we can give the tenants a little bit more breathing room, they can kind of take that breath and say, all right, what do we do? Okay, I got at least 60 days rather than 30, or ideally I'd like to see like 3 months notice for evictions, but that won't be anytime soon, unfortunately. I'm going to be honest.
Okay. So let me, we have more questions in the chat, and I'm looking for, I'm trying to progress here in a
oh no, you're being garbled up again.
Semi-logical manner. So we've been talking about housing models. Oop, am I back?
A little bit. Maybe you might just have to go off video. I don't know if that would help out.
Oh
your
yeah,
audience.
maybe I'll just, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so if you can hear me better, hopefully that'll work. We were talking about cooperative housing initiatives and actions. And I know you mentioned Maggie Fogarty's efforts on the Seacoast. Are there communities that have successfully implemented a housing first policy where we can look to as a model for where it's working so far? I realize you've only been with RAD since 2020, but if there are examples you know of.
Yeah. So to my knowledge, there's no municipality anywhere in America where housing first has actually been implemented. It has been done on a small scale. There have been studies that have been conducted on it. And personally, Manchester, New Hampshire did do a limited housing first study. They had about 12 participants that were enrolled in housing first. And these were specifically targeted at people with substance use disorder. And of the 12 that participated, I believe at least 9 were actually able to stay sober for their stay there, which is a higher success rate than any sort of shelter or other programs that have been tried. Other countries have actually implemented a housing first solution and to great success. From what I understand, countries like Finland, I got to look more into what they've done in Europe, but those tend to be countries too that actually invest in public housing as well. So the rates of homelessness there are just completely lower, and they have more safety nets as well too. So on small scales that it's been done, it's worked, but Utah tried to implement a housing first program. I want to say back in 2015. There are still a lot of problems with how they actually implemented it I was just doing some research on it. It looks like there was a lack of coordination between like the social workers that are doing with the public outreach, and then the program was a little slow and clunky and wasn't able to rapidly rehouse people. One thing you have to really keep in mind when dealing with the houseless population is that 24 hours is an eternity. If you cannot provide that service right away, they might not feel comfortable enough reaching out again for months or years. Particularly, there was one gentleman in Manchester who was already 48 hours sober from heroin, and was told that he wasn't able to get a bed for his treatment for at least 2 days. And he said, I'm not going to be able to stay sober that long. This was over a year ago, and this man is actually still using. So a lot of it is the implementation. A lot of times, governments will provide services and say, hey, we have these services available, but they're not available in ways that actually make sense to somebody who is houseless. A lot of these services are designed by people who have never experienced houselessness. And if I'm really cynical, I would say these services exist to make it look like they're doing something and to shut us up who are complaining that there aren't enough services. Also, I saw Will's question and I kind of want to answer it. I don't know if you're going to get around to it. So you were asking, Will, how
We
much?
should, the NDA. Absolutely.
So Will, you were referencing the defense budget that was just passed or is about to be passed. So okay, so if I were to just hire all capitalist developers, for-profit developers, it seems at least we'll use New Hampshire prices. I'm gonna be like really like I'm gonna highball the cost of building and everything like that. Okay, if it costs about $300,000 per unit, and that's like for it to be owned by a private landlord after. Yeah, 300K per unit. I did the math. That would build almost 3 million homes, about 2.8 million homes right there. So yeah, it's really about what our priorities are, I guess. What do we value more? I think that's pretty apparent, you know?
Would that 3 million homes solve homelessness? Would that be enough to?
It would help a lot. So there, I would say it's hard to say because if you were to look at it from purely a supply and demand problem, which I find that a lot of liberals and conservatives view it as, they would say, yes, that completely solves homelessness or houselessness. I say that it would fix the problem for a little bit, but I think still like the private ownership of housing, the fact that housing increases faster than wages do, that's unsustainable. I mean, you're told that you're supposed to, you know, pay a mortgage for 30 years. And at the end of that 30 years, that house is going to be worth significantly more. And then the new workers that are hopefully going to buy the house when you sell it are somehow able to afford it. So I just think that it wouldn't really address the root of the problem, if that makes sense, which is that we view housing not as a public good. If I can also kind of go off on a soapbox here. So I'm always told that I'm dumb and that I don't understand basic economics. So I took an economics course in college. And what I learned from there is that housing is an inelastic good. So that just means that it's not subject to regular fluctuations in the market. And it's because it's something that people will pay pretty much all of their income to keep. So it doesn't really quite work. Like increasing supply of housing won't necessarily drive down the costs in the way that we think it will. And also in reality, yeah, it just doesn't change our relationship with housing, and it doesn't address things like lack of generational wealth. It doesn't address things like, you know, you can still get evicted if you lose your job and your health care and everything like that. But it would help, I guess, to answer that.
Okay. Will, did you have a follow-up or?
I posted in the chat. This is based on, you know, what it costs housing and urban development per year to house a houseless person, and their figure to house every houseless person is about 20 billion per year. And that was just a Google search. And obviously that's not providing housing. It's not increasing housing. It's not dealing with the reality that we don't have enough places for people to live. Which your estimation does there, but it was just an interesting.
Yeah. So it's about what half of the aid we've sent to Ukraine. You know,
about a third of a third of the weapons aid, or a quarter of the total aid.
Yeah. So again, and you know what, I don't want to get too much into the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But yeah, I mean, it just shows you, like, you know, if we want to send weapons to Ukraine, we do it. If we wanted to end homelessness or houselessness, we could. But I just don't think that we want to as a society.
Well, whether
oh, sorry, go on.
Oh, sorry, Brandon, go ahead.
No, I did. I know you're curating questions, so please let me know if I'm stepping on your toes. I did see a question in the chat from Robert that I wanted to address. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So Robert asked, how do we serve those who refuse shelter and prefer to stay on the street? That is a difficult question there. I would say that a lot of the services that exist suck. Like they are not good at all. They're terrible. Shelters, I would never put my mother in a shelter. Okay, I would not want any human being to have to live in those hellholes. They are fraught with bed bugs. robberies, PTSD. There are many reasons why somebody would not want to actually take the services that are offered. One example is the shelter in Manchester is a low barrier shelter, meaning that you can be actively using substances while you go in there. And that's great. We need spaces like that. But there was one guy that I talked to that's houseless. He was 1 year sober, and his dealer was living in the shelter. And he was afraid that if he went back into the shelter, that he would be tempted to then use again. And let's also, sorry, this is sensitive here, but sexual assaults are rampant in shelters. And oftentimes, especially women who tend to be disproportionately affected by this, have a lot of PTSD associated with shelters as well. So my answer there is make the services better. I guess, like, if the option was, hey, go into this, like, 1,000 square foot apartment for you. Don't worry about the bills. We'll get you there, but you have to take some counseling. And if they refuse that, maybe I would be in favor of more authoritarian methods of like forcing them to make make a choice. But I would much rather try to incentivize people to taking those services rather than, sending like a police baton to go and, crack their skulls open because they wanted to sleep in a park. So yeah, I guess make the services better is the short answer. And then we can talk about why people don't actually use the services. I think there's a mentality of like that the houseless are ungrateful for the services that we provide. But again, I'm the kind of guy, I'm going to complain if we ever hit utopia, I'm going to be complaining that like the free water is too hot or something like that, so again, just because the services is there doesn't mean that like it's actually good enough for somebody to take.
Thanks. So just to clarify, not everyone who refuses housing is interested in remaining houseless.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I would also support a way to have people just camp legally as well too, because there is also, I have talked to veterans who are experiencing a lot of PTSD and don't do well around other people, and they actually prefer living in the woods. I would like to see more camping options available too. So they still have access to like running water and stuff like that. And we can send social workers there to actually develop relationships with them as well.
Okay, well, this may fold into Janet's question too. And she mentions, she says, do you think that the efforts in some places to increase workforce housing or to diversify the stock of housing available are in the same bucket of issues as houselessness, or should they be considered separately as, from housing insecurity per se?
That is a great question. Yeah, I think that I have to say that houselessness and housing are separate but related issues. So I think that like things like workforce housing are definitely things that we need to be considering, right? Now, my number one concern is who owns the housing. And I believe that, we are in a society that's going to benefit realtors and landlords and developers before they actually benefit workers. And I want to emphasize that we only really care about workforce housing here in New Hampshire because conservatives have realized that businesses are having a nightmare trying to hire workers who can afford to live here. So, again, I like the idea that they're going after like a certain type of housing that's missing from the market. And I think that it's needed, but yeah, we need to consider that separately from houselessness. But I think addressing things like that will ease the burden and create less houselessness. I always like to say that eviction is very much like a waterfall, right? And, you're paddling on a canoe towards the waterfall. And if you get off on the bank at any point, and we catch you, then, it's much easier, right? But once you've fallen off the waterfall, it's really difficult to get back up. And so I think increasing supply would help people be able to, get a lifeline to the shore or to the banks. That metaphor might have tapered off towards the end there, so I apologize.
So would you, another sort of category of housing we haven't talked too much about tonight is that provided for veterans. So there's a veteran housing movement in some communities in New Hampshire. I know that there's a relatively newer housing complex for vets here where I am in Plymouth. And I'm just wondering about your perspective about that, because it's more based on, you know, the fact that you've served, nothing to do with your military record per se. In other words, it's not about who's more or less deserving to get housing. So even though the need is outpacing the demand, this is Susan's question, it is maybe one example of a housing first program that has had at least partial success. And so, you know, trying to implement that or models like that might go further.
Yeah, and actually I forgot to mention, the VA has done studies on housing first. And from what I've read, they recommend it as a means to approaching you know, veteran houselessness. Yeah, I'm a little, yeah, again, like the fact that I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm sure here, but the fact that like veteran homelessness or houselessness is a thing is absolutely, it completely blows my mind, right? It really goes to show that we love war but hate veterans. And I'm a little conflicted because I do support like constituency kind of based like approaches to houselessness, right? So for instance, you know, I do think that we need more veteran, you know, houselessness services. We definitely need more services, especially for like survivors of domestic violence, youth houselessness as well. And you know, my solution here is the best way to end veteran houselessness is to just end houselessness. But unfortunately, I think that we don't value everybody in this country. So, you know, this could be a way, and it's a way that I point to a lot. I say, hey, Housing First has worked on veterans here. It's proven to work. And I find that it gets some more conservative leaning people to be like, oh, okay, well, okay, that works for veterans. All right, I guess it could work. So it's kind of a way to get our foot in the door with Housing First. But I think it just needs to be universally done. I think you deserve housing by virtue of being a human being. Does that answer the question?
I think so. And it's a kind of a great note to be to have as a final statement. You deserve housing because you're human. You know, it's a kind of great summary statement. Thank you so much, Brandon, for answering this whole litany of questions and for your great comments and presentation. We're very thankful for such a great interchange among our audience and you. And aside from my horrifying, I think, technical issues at the beginning of our evening, I think it went really, really well. And thanks to your contact info, Brandon, you've just put it in the chat, I see. Thank you everyone for your questions. So I wanted to just mention that Brandon, again, is at radnh.org. That's the New Hampshire chapter of Rights and Democracy, where he is the statewide coordinator for housing justice. So RAD was kind enough to co-sponsor this event tonight, and I would be remiss without mentioning that. I'd like to just close us out with just a note to stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action and our conversation series by checking us out at newhampshirepeaceaction.org/events. We have some upcoming programs, including, well, actually, I probably should mention we are finishing our end of year appeal for the end of this year. So please do feel free to contribute what you can, no obligation. We have a couple of events coming up on January 2nd. Will is going to begin our new year with us. And we are beginning something new just about 10 days later than that. Sandra and Amy from our board are going to launch a book study with Donna Hicks' book called Dignity. If you'd like to know more about our upcoming events, you can certainly use that link in the chat function of our events page. And members receive a Friday email with a whole list of details about our upcoming events. We do hope that you can join us. This series will remain free and open to everyone. We appreciate any kind of financial support you'd like to offer, but it's not an obligation because the engagement we do here is important and critical. So with that, I want to thank Brandon and my co-hosts, Amy and Will. Thanks so much, Brandon, for being with us. It is a joy to see you from our days at Plymouth State. You've really, I'm just so proud to know you.
Well,
So,
thank you. Thank you for letting me rant about housing for an hour.
Thank you, everyone, for joining with us tonight. We will see you again next time.